Hello and welcome to part 3 of my Archipelago board game review. In part 1 I showed you how to play the game. Part 2 I showed you some example gameplay. And in part 3 I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about Archipelago, the game. Now Archipelago retails for $90, which on the surface I agree may seem like a high price for a board game. It's a luxury type thing. $90 is kind of high, especially when you look at some board games you can get as cheap as $20, and the average median price these days seems to be about $55 or $60. But this may be one of those rare instances where I think the $90 price tag is very, very justified just looking at what you get in the game box. First of all, the best thing you need to talk about with this game is the fact that this game has a very high quality molded insert. Everything that comes with this game fits easily in this box, fits comfortably in this box, and there is a location for every single thing, every component that comes with the game. Everything fits in here very nicely. And not only that, the game even has a removable section where you can pull out just so you can hand around this item, which allows you to build the game board, but you can easily pass this around to all the players. It's just one extra thing that adds cost to a game. And just to give you an idea, there's a reason why companies such as Fantasy Flight Games and other companies, which are very large, very successful companies, the best thing they give you for a game insert is a strip of cardboard, which the only purpose is to keep your components separated as they ship it from their warehouse to your door. So just looking at this fantastic insert, you got to give the company that designed Archipelago a big thumbs up, because there's a lot of time that went into this, a lot of effort that went into this, and also a lot of finances that went into designing this highly high quality board game insert. But let's be honest, we don't play a board game to stare at the insert. We play a board game to play with the game pieces, and we want those game pieces to be also really high quality. And luckily, I can report that the high quality continues with all the game pieces. Now, this game comes with a lot of wooden components. We have wooden components for a total of 5 different players. And there's a lot of wooden components in here, not quite as much as you're going to get in a game of such as Caverna, which is another $90 game. But this definitely comes close to rivaling the amount of wooden components you get in Terra Mystica, especially when you count up the total amount of components for the players, the total amount of wooden components for all the resources you're going to have, plus the fact that you got some very high quality cardboard that comes in this game box. Now, these tiles used for the board that you're going to be playing on, that you make up the Archipelago, these are thick cardboard. They're all double-sided, and there's actually some really good artwork on these tiles. These tiles have a lot of character on them. There's a lot of small details that you can actually pick up on if you take these tiles and start looking at them. There's some beach scenes where you get to see a guy who's out there drawing a monkey in the sand. There's waves. There's a lot of artistic detail that went into the design of these tiles to make them much more pleasing to the eye. And again, they're thick cardboard. Again, they're all double-sided. And again, they're all designed to line up to make a wonderful, great-looking board where you actually look like you have a living, breathing world. I can't comment on this enough, but when you play Archipelago, it actually feels like you're designing a real world, because this game is designed for the tiles to fit in a very logical manner. So you're actually designing a world that looks realistic. So when you get done playing the game, you can actually look at what you designed and feel like you had part in designing a realistic world. And I'm not going to take the time to design it. You saw when I was playing the game, when you look down from a top view, it looks like what could possibly be a real island formation. It looks cool. It's nice to look at. And speaking of nice, the advancement cards that come with the game, they all have their own individual artwork. Now, there's 48 of these cards, and the artwork on these cards is full color. And this is artwork that's obviously been done by a professional artist. These are full color art. We're not talking about pencil sketches or anything like that. You can look at this art and see that the people look like people. They're really well drawn. They're not caricatures. These are what I'd expect from almost like an oil painting kind of quality pictures. Very, very good artwork. Whoever the artist was that they hired for Archipelago definitely needs a thumbs up, because he did, or he or she, I should say, did a fantastic job with all the artwork. From the boards, from the tiles, to the cards, the artwork is really well done. The artwork even continues to all these boards, and again, we're looking at high quality cardboard here. There's artwork on the back which is totally unnecessary, but it just shows the extra effort they put forward to make sure that you're looking at a game that shows that somebody was willing to put a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra effort to make sure that you are looking at a wonderfully eye-pleasing game. The game also has some built-in replayability, and now, while normally that's something I'd comment about when I actually give you my final thoughts, I also want to talk about when I'm talking about the component quality, because you actually have 3 different levels of gameplay you have here that are going to give you 3 different levels of playing time, and the game's going to play differently depending on which level of these cards you pick, and it's a really nice touch. This is something I would have expected to have to pay extra for in an actual expansion, but luckily they included this in the base game, and it's definitely a little bit of extra value for your dollar. Anytime you're getting extra replay value without having to buy expansions, I'm definitely a fan of that. They also took the time to make sure they balanced the game for different player counts, and that's why you have a double-sided board here. Again, thick cardboard. Matter of fact, the only thing in the game that isn't thick cardboard are the cards themselves and these player shields. And while these player shields aren't super thick, they're definitely not paper thin. And they also took the time to, again, showing the eye pleasing, they put some artwork on the front of these cards. Again, just to make the game look a little bit better when it's set up. Now, I took a lot of extra time explaining these components just because I want to emphasize the point. I think $90, yes, that's a lot of money to play for a board game. I don't think that's a lot of money to pay for Archipelago. I think that's a pretty good price point for everything you're getting here. And I'm definitely saying good job here on the design of Archipelago. Now, before you think I'm going to start throwing heaps of praise on Ludicoli for a fantastic package here, there is one major negative I have with the game, and it's going to be in the rule book itself. Now, I'm actually a fortunate person. I actually have the second edition of the rule book, and this is for anybody who bought the game. I think after May of 2013, you should have access to the second edition rule book, which has some clarifications. But even with those clarifications, there are still some ambiguities to the rules, and you're basically going to have to make a decision when you play this game. There's just going to be some situations where you come upon a rule, and the rule book, it's going to be ambiguous. It's not going to be specific enough, and you're basically going to have to look at all the players and say, we need to make a decision. This is how we're going to play the game every time we play it, and that's just a permanent decision for the rest of the game. For a really good example, and I think I talked about this when I was telling you how to play the game, I was talking about how one of the cards, when you play it, it's going to lower the rebel track by 2 for every single church that's in the game. I think the original design of the game was that you're supposed to lower the rebel track by 2 for every church that happens to be in the archipelago. But we decided as a group that thematically it was better that only a church, if it was occupied, would lower the rebel track by 2. We're not sure that's the right way to play, but we like that decision better. But to accentuate the point, the rule book was not specific enough on that, at least not for us. And that's just one example of how the rule book can be kind of ambiguous. You're going to run into some examples where this rule book isn't perfect. You're basically going to have to grin and bear it, or, watch my tutorial video. I'm pretty much convinced that I have about 99% of the rules correct here, but I'm waiting for somebody to correct me so I at least can learn how to play the game properly too. But again, I'm pretty sure I got most of the game rules correct on how to play Archipelago. Every time I do a review for a board game, it's very important for me to cover 2 very important, personally, for me, aspects of the game. The first thing is family friendliness. I'm a father of 2 younger kids, and I enjoy playing board games with my younger kids. So I was like to take a few minutes to comment on just how family friendly a board game may be for a family. The other thing I'd like to discuss is perfect player count. Now, we're all familiar with those board games that advertise that they're from 3 to 6 players. But we know that we will never, ever play those board games ever again with 3 players because they're absolutely horrible. But if we get 5 or 6 players together, we know we're pulling that board game out every single time we have friends over just because it's that great with that player count. So for me, it's very important to always comment on just how good a board game plays at various player counts. Archipelago lists as a game for 2 to 5 players with a solo expansion, which again I have 0 experience with, but if you are interested in playing the game solo, you can pick it up and make this a 1-player game. Again, I'm not quite aware of how well the game plays solo. Maybe somebody who has experience can comment here and maybe make suggestions if you are interested in the solo gameplay. The game is also listed as a game for ages 14 and up. And I'm going to just say it, this is a very potentially complex game. The phase order can be complex, the actions can be complex, learning the game can be complex, but at least once you have one person who's very familiar with the gameplay, it's not that hard to teach other players, especially have somebody who can know the rules well enough to tell the players exactly how to play, because it's one of those games that's much easier to teach than to pull out the rule book and try to learn from scratch. Having said that, though, this is definitely one of the more complex Euro games out there. It has mechanics I'd say probably are on par with games such as Terra Mystica, or probably on par with Caverna, or actually probably make it a little more complex than Caverna. That's probably my decision. Not as complex as Agricola, but definitely more complex than Caverna. The game has a lot of things that probably are going to be very difficult for younger players. The worst part is going to be the negotiation. This is definitely a game of very cutthroat negotiation where players are going to be having some very, call it heated debates while they're trying to negotiate the best deal for themselves, whether they're negotiating for player order, whether negotiations are for the rebels, or whether they're negotiation for anything else that can happen in the game that you're allowed to negotiate for. There's definitely some very cutthroat negotiation that goes on in a game of Archipelago. Not only that, the game can feel extremely overwhelming when you're first learning how to play the game for an adult. And even after multiple plays as an adult, it can still feel extremely overwhelming. And that's simply because of the hidden victory conditions, or I should call it the hidden end game conditions, and also for the hidden scoring conditions. This is a game where you need to learn how to read other players very well, while not telegraphing your own intentions. And that's, again, something else that is not very easy for younger players to do. Basically, what I'm saying is that there is a lot in this game that's preventing this from being a game for younger players. The game says 14 and up. I think 14 up is definitely a very good minimum age to play this game. This is definitely a game for the older crowd. You can probably get a 12-year-old to play this game. They probably get a little bit lost, but they probably have a lot of fun with the game. You can probably play with younger players, but I can guarantee they're not going to get the finer details of the game. They're not going to get the finer strategies of the game. And while they may have fun just because they're interacting with mommy or daddy, they're definitely just not going to get the enjoyment out of a complex game such as this. Unfortunately, Archipelago is one of those games that does have a wide variety on the player count. Again, if you buy the expansion, anywhere from 1 to 5 players. But I think this is definitely one of those games that plays better with a higher player count. Now, don't get me wrong, this game is definitely very good with 2 players, but I'm a longtime fan of Christoph Boelinger, and I actually own one of his best 2-player games, not Earth Reborn, which is also a good game, but I think Dungeon Twister is probably one of the best 2-player games I happen to have in my board game collection of nearly 300 board games now. I think it's a fantastic 2-player game, and it's one of my go-to 2-player games, and it kind of colors my opinion on other games played as 2 players. Now, Archipelago, again, is not a bad game as 2 players, but to me, most of the enjoyment is going to come in as you start adding more players. The more players you add, the more intense the negotiation is going to be. The more players you add, the more higher chances of getting the separatists coming into the game, and also more chances for the pacifists coming into the game. As you add more players, you have more competition for the victory points. In a 5-player game, no matter how well you do, no matter how many resources you get, there's still going to be 2 players who are not going to get any victory points for each one of these victory condition cards. Whether that's one of these green cards, or whether it's one of these hidden objective cards, not everybody's going to be able to score victory points, making it much more tense and much more cutthroat to get those victory points. Not only that, the more players you have, the more of these victory point cards you're actually going to have in the game. In a 5-player game, you're going to have 5 of these cards plus 1 of these cards, and if you want to use some of the variants, and again, I didn't get into this, but this game does have quite a few very good variants to adjust the gameplay and kind of pick up some of the deficiencies the game can have with different player counts. I definitely recommend some of those variants. Read over them because they may be better for you depending on how many players you want to play this game with. But my point is that the more players you have, the more opportunity you have to get these extra victory points and a little bit more of the interaction. The negative, though, is that the more players you add, the more chaos you can have and the higher potential for analysis paralysis as players start over-analyzing all the other players, trying to figure out exactly what they're going for, so you figure out what their victory conditions are, so you figure out what their end game conditions are, and that can bog the game down. I wasn't kidding when I said earlier that if you have a 4 or 5 player game using the long gameplay cards, you're looking at a possibility of a 4-hour game. It's not going to happen every time, but it's definitely a possibility. Even with the medium gameplay cards, you're still looking at probably about 2.5 hours with a 5-player game. So again, the more players you add, the more time you're going to be playing this game. In my opinion, the game, I think, plays best as a 4-player game. It's good as a 3 and 5-player game. Still pretty good as a 2-player game, but I think you're going to have the best experience playing Archipelago as a 4-player game. You're going to get the best ratio of interaction, best ratio of victory points for the amount of time you're going to invest in every time you play this game. Again, Archipelago, great 4-player game, really good 3 and 5-player game, and still a pretty darn decent 2-player game. Although one little caveat I will say with a 5-player game versus a 3-player game, a 5-player game can be quite a bit more chaotic, and the crisis cards can be a little bit more damaging than the 3-player game. So if I had to choose between this game as a 3 or 5-player game, my order would be best as a 4-player, second best as a 3-player, next best as a 5-player, and my final play choice would be as a 2-player game. Before I picked up Archipelago, I had a pretty good feeling that it was going to be a game that I would probably at least enjoy at a decent level. And the reason why I say that is because I am a fan of the designer Christoph Boelinger. Again, as I said earlier, he actually designed one of my favorite 2-player games, Dungeon Twister, which I enjoyed a lot. I've also seen the way he designed other games such as Earth Reborn. Matter of fact, the only negative I've ever had about the designer Christoph Boelinger is the fact that it seems like it's impossible to get him to design an actual expansion for any of his games. Fortunately, Archipelago has broken that mold. He actually has 2 expansions now for the game. I've already mentioned the first one, which is the solo player expansion. There's also a second expansion called War and Peace, which adds a lot more direct interaction cards, and also it fixes one of the small details that I kind of had a problem with the game, which is the fact that iron in the base game doesn't really have a lot of uses. As a matter of fact, if you see a player who's starting to hoard iron, it's almost a 99% dead giveaway that they have the hidden card that allows them to score victory points for having the most iron at the end of the game. It's generally a dead giveaway for the simple fact there aren't a lot of evolution cards that actually use iron, and iron isn't used that much in the base game. And luckily that War and Peace expansion actually adds a lot of cards. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. I think there's about 7 or maybe 8 cards that actually use iron, but they use iron quite a bit. And they also allow you to directly interact with your opponents on a much stronger basis. There's very cool cards in there that allow you to throw other players out of towns, allow you to attack other players, and basically more directly interact with the other players. While this game already has a lot of direct interaction, it's always nice to have the potential for even more direct interaction. And I can definitely say, even though the War and Peace expansion was not part of this review, I can definitely say if you like the base game of Archipelago, I can definitely say you should definitely pick up the expansion War and Peace. Now, if you like the style of the game that Archipelago is, which is basically a Euro game with a lot of strong negotiation mechanics and a little bit more aggression than you may be used to from your standard Euro game, there's a lot of positives to comment on why you may like Archipelago. One of the first things I really like about Archipelago is the fact that there's variable player length, or I'm sorry, variable game duration. Again, I've already harped on this quite a bit, but you have 10 different cards in each one of these decks that are going to allow you to have variable player length. And these cards definitely make a huge difference on the amount of time it's going to take to play this game. You're basically looking at about an extra hour between each one of these decks that they're going to add. You're looking at about an hour and a half game, 2 to 2.5 hour, 3.5 to possibly 4 hour game, depending on which deck you want to use. And not only that, I also like how these decks, depending on whichever deck you use, are going to add different victory conditions, making sure the game is never going to play the same way twice. Not only do you have the 12 trend cards that all players have access to, which is open information for all the players, you also have the hidden information of these 10 cards. And again, even in a 5-player game, only half of these cards are going to be used, and you never know exactly which 5 of these 10 cards are going to be used. And if you even have a two-player game, you're only looking at about 2 of possibly 10 cards being used. That's going to add a large amount of replayability just in the base game without having to go out there and buy any expansions. Another nice thing about the game is that the rulebook does come with a lot of variants in the back end of the game. We're not looking at about 1 or 2 variants that are going to cause minor differences in the game. You're actually looking at quite a bit of different variants that are going to modify the game. There's a benefactor variant, which is actually one I definitely highly recommend. It's actually one we're starting to play with almost every time we play the game. There's also ways to change the 2-player game, and it's all down here. Again, lots of variants for the game, and they're definitely going to add to the game and add a lot of replay value to a game that, while may cost a lot of money, again, a $90 investment may seem like a lot, but you're getting a lot of value for your dollar. And to be honest, I've actually seen this game for less than $60 on Amazon, so I think the cheapest I saw was about $55, and at $55, this game is definitely a steal. I've already harped on enough on how fantastic this insert is. It's very nice to know that I can take all the components for the game, pack all the components in the game, stick this game on my game shelf, and I don't have to worry about everything sliding all over the place because everything fits so nicely back in the box. And yes, everything does fit very nicely. I'm just kind of tossing these things in right now, but just know that everything fits very nicely. You can basically seal up this box, stick it on your game shelf, and everything's going to sit very nicely because of this wonderfully designed insert, which you also use when you play the game. There's also some extremely nice artwork on the game. I've already shown you some of the artwork, but this artwork is definitely top-notch artwork. We're talking about really good artwork that's not basic sketches. Full color artwork looks fantastic when it's laid out on the table. I also like the interesting mechanics. Now, some of us are fans of co-ops. Some of us aren't fans of co-ops. Some of us like games we're all against each other. Some of us like games where we're working together. This game kind of has a nice balance. Now, it's billed as a semi-co-op, and I think it's kind of a silly comment for the game because that's not really a semi-co-op. There's no win as a group in this game. There's no hidden traitor mechanic, technically, unless you got the Separatist. There's definitely going to be one player and only one player at all who's going to win the game. The reason why it's billed as a semi-co-op is because it's possible for the game to defeat the players if you manage to get the rebel track to bypass the amount of colonists on the island, then all the players lose as a whole. And basically what that means is that players need to sometimes not do the optimal moves for their player to advance their score if it means that it's going to wipe out all the players. Sometimes you need to make those sacrifices, and that's where the semi-cooperative gameplay comes in. But trust me, the semi-co-op is very minor. You're definitely playing for one winner only. I also really enjoy the secret victory conditions, the secret game ending conditions, and I really enjoy the negotiation in this game. But I will freely admit that's probably going to be the most polarizing aspect of this game. If you don't enjoy negotiation, I can probably say, no matter how much you like the gameplay from what you saw, I can probably say if you don't like negotiation, you probably should steer clear of Archipelago. I can also say that if you don't like hidden scoring or hidden endgame conditions, no matter how much you liked everything else you saw from my gameplay demonstration, I can again definitely say you probably want to steer clear of Archipelago, at least until you get one gameplay in, because this is one game where the negotiation is very strong, and some people like it, some people really hate negotiation, and this is a game where the victory conditions are pretty much hidden to the other players, until you've gotten a lot of plays under your belt and you're able to read the other players. But again, that's going to take you probably a half dozen plays before you get to that point. And again, if you're one of those people who doesn't like knowing what you need to be going after because you kind of feel lost, you feel like you're overwhelmed, you feel like you're lacking direction, that's something you're going to feel when you're playing this game, because you're going to be going, okay, do I want to play this? Do I not want to play this? Is it going to help one of my opponents? Is this going to end the game? If I build this town right now, is the game going to come to an end? If I collect all the resources I need, is the game going to come to an end? Is this move going to hurt me? Is it going to help me? It can cause an extreme amount of analysis paralysis if you overanalyze it, and it's very, very easy to overanalyze it, especially in your earlier plays of this game where you're still learning it and you're still trying to get the hang of all the mechanics. This is also one of those games where player order can make a huge difference, and it can be almost crippling in a 5-player game. It's very, very possible to be having a 5-player game. And one bad thing about these crisis cards is these crisis cards really aren't quite scaled to the player count, because you're going to get a crisis card where in like a 2 or a 3 player game, it's going to be very, very easy to overcome the crisis by using only 1 or 2 resources, very easily to overcome, and it's not going to be too much of a problem for the players. But when you're looking at a 5-player game where everybody has an average of 5 citizens out on the board, or 5 meeples, whatever word you want to use, you're looking at 25 possible meeples that can go into rebellion, which is going to take you a heck of a lot more resources. Just to use this crisis card right here as an example, in a 5-player game where every player has 5 meeples, you're going to need 6 cows to overcome this crisis, because you're going to need enough to overcome this crisis, which is going to be 6 cows, just by doing the quick math here. In a 2-player game where every player has exactly 5 meeples, you're only going to need 2 cows to overcome this crisis, meaning that the trademark is probably going to help you more often than not in a lower player count. But in a higher player count, these crisis cards can be extremely devastating on the player order. And you definitely in a higher player count game need to fight for that player order, especially if you haven't had a lot of luck with exploration and you don't have resources to fall back on to help you to avoid those revolts, where you can end up losing all your workers and not have access to them. And you can pretty much snowball if you get a couple bad actions in a row. It can be kind of tough to make a comeback from it, especially if the game just happens to have it out for you. And now we come to one of the probably the worst negatives of the game. Anytime you have a game which has this much potential replay value, you have replay value from all these scoring conditions. You have replay value by the way, the different way the evolution cards are going to lay out. You have a different replay value by just how random these tiles are going to come out. It is possible, it's not going to happen a lot, but it's occasionally going to happen where the tiles are going to be against you, the evolution cards are going to be against you, and possibly the scoring and end-game conditions are just going to be against you. It's possible to play a 2-player game where one of the players is going to be the revolutionist. They're going to get the perfect evolution cards that are going to come out, and they're going to score a very, very easy win. It can happen, and it's just something that's going to happen anytime you offer a game that has this much replay value built into one box with this much variety. I have to be honest with you, sometimes you're going to have those suboptimal gameplay experiences. Now, it's not going to happen a lot. Most of the time, you're going to have a fantastic gameplay experience, but just understand, once in a great while, everything's going to line up against you, and you're going to have a pretty suboptimal experience. I also think the rulebook could use a 3rd revision where they add a couple extra pages where they take some time to possibly explain some of these cards a little bit better, explain some of these cards a little better. Now, while this game rulebook does explain to you how some of the evolution cards work, you know there's 48 evolution cards in the game, and they only go into greater detail on these couple evolution cards. There's ambiguities in the rulebook. There's things that just don't feel like they're fully fleshed out. They definitely need a 3rd revision on the rulebook here. And this is definitely one of those games where it's very, very easy to feel completely overwhelmed the first couple times you play. You're going to feel overwhelmed by the fact that you're trying to figure out exactly what kind of strategy you need to play to win the game. You're going to feel overwhelmed because you're going to try to figure out what your opponents are going after so you can try to score victory points by whatever their victory point conditions are too. You're going to feel overwhelmed because you're going to be trying to figure out how you need to go about getting yourself out of a hole you possibly dug yourself in because you didn't take some good actions when you should have. Maybe you explored too much in the beginning. Maybe you didn't explore enough in the beginning. Maybe you expanded too quickly in the beginning. Maybe you didn't gather resources in the beginning. All these things are going to happen to you the first couple times you play the game, and you're definitely going to feel overwhelmed and you're going to feel lost. Luckily, I can guarantee after a couple plays of this game, it's going to make a lot more sense. The strategies are going to start becoming more apparent, and you're going to understand what you need to work on and when to avoid putting yourselves in those bad circumstances that you are going to have a hard time recovering from. Also, these unknown endgame conditions can be a double-edged sword. Again, this can cause a lot of analysis paralysis because sometimes you may be afraid to perform an action because you're afraid that you just might bring about the endgame when you're not ready for it, when you're still trying to get your engine going. And you're basically going to freeze up the first couple times you're playing the game. You're going to do the mental math and you go, okay, we have 4 players. There's already 4 ports out. I need one more port to do an action that's going to give me some victory points. But if I do that, am I going to bring about the end game? And I'm going to definitely lose. And you're basically going to lock up the first couple times you play as you're trying to decide in a way whether you should go ahead with an action or not. It's just going to slow you down the first couple times you play. You can also expect the first early games to kind of snowball, especially with the trend cards. You're going to see one player start hoarding all the fish, if that happens to be your trend card. And as soon as one person does that, everybody else is going to start hoarding fish. So you're going to basically have a follow the leader mentality. And again, it's just something that's going to happen with your early games. There's no way around it. It's every time I've shown players how to play this game, as soon as one person starts working for a trend card, everybody does it. It's almost like a dog pile on that trend card. Also, the first couple times you play this game, expect a couple of oops instances where somebody's going to stop, say, wait a minute, the game's already over. I completely missed the fact that my victory endgame condition has already been passed. Now, again, that's something that's going to happen in the early times you play the game because you're going to be concentrating on so much on everything else that's going on. You're going to forget to pay attention to your endgame condition. My suggestion for this when you're first learning how to play the game is to have the back of the rule book open. Memorize, well, maybe memorize is the wrong word, but keep a mental picture of what things that can cause the end game to come about. And anytime somebody does one of those actions, do a loud count. Like, for instance, if somebody builds a port, say, port number 4 has been built. Town number 3 has been built. One of the resource slots in the bank is now empty. Do things like that. It's going to help the players when they're first learning the game to realize when an end game condition is coming along, and it's going to stop them from getting that tunnel vision, so you're not going to get those instances where somebody will say, hey guys, I'm sorry, the game was over 2 turns ago. I forgot I missed the end game condition. I can also suggest that this may not be the best game to play if you happen to have one of those players in your group who happens to be one of those vendetta players. You know, the kind of player who says, if I can't win, nobody's going to win. And this is definitely one of those games where you can abuse that very fact just because it's a semi-cooperative game. It's very possible if you're one of those vindictive players, if you're in last place, you can force the revolution track to start skyrocketing. And if you can manage to bypass the current amount of citizens that happen to be in the archipelago, you can force all the players to lose. Yeah, it's a jerk move, and my suggestion is if you have somebody who likes to play that way, you find a shock collar and you put it around their neck every time you play Archipelago. That's my suggestion. Maybe you probably shouldn't follow that suggestion, but I don't generally like those kind of players in my play group, and I'm pretty fortunate I don't have any of those vendetta players, but it's definitely a potential problem you may experience. And finally, one other thing I must mention about the game is the Separatists can waffle anywhere from being overpowered to underpowered, just depending on what kind of cards come out of the Evolution deck. I've seen some Evolution cards that'll pop out that can make the Revolutionist have a pretty easy time of things, especially if the Revolutionist happens to get the Pirate card, which is a card that can start slowly moving up the Rebel track. There's also a couple of other Evolution cards that can easily start skyrocketing the evolution track, and if you happen to be the Separatist and you happen to get those evolution cards, it's pretty darn easy to pull out a win as a Separatist. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you don't get access to those cards and you have a lot of players who happen to have a lot of the evolution cards that can bring down the Rebel track, it can become almost impossible to win the game as a Separatist. Again, it's back on the fact that, as I said earlier, there's a lot of randomness in this game, and sometimes there's going to be a combination that can fall a little bit flat. It's the nature of the beast. I don't think it's bad enough that's going to pop up all the time, but once in a while it may happen. My suggestion is play the game again, because this is definitely a fun game that deserves multiple gameplays. My final opinion of Archipelago is it's a very, very good worker placement game with some fantastic negotiation potential, some fantastic replay variety, and some really good mechanics built in a game that fits the theme very, very well. The game looks beautiful when it's set up. I have a lot of fun playing it, and out of all the people I've shown this game to, I've only had one person have a negative experience who says they probably don't want to play the game again. Everybody else I've shown it to has enjoyed the game greatly and says they definitely want to play the game again. This has been a very long-winded review of Archipelago. I knew this review would run very, very long, probably going to rival the length of my Arkham Horror review, but this is definitely a game that deserves a lot of screen time. It's a great game, in my opinion, as a worker placement game, a great game for the price, and a great game possibly to add to your playgroup. This has been another off-the-shelf board game review looking at Archipelago. Thanks for watching.